Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. Alhamdulillah Rabbil alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, with the grace, mercy and protection and guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with His permission, biiznillah, we continue our program in teaching you the science of ilmu tauhid, kalam, cosmology. So we have given you some idea of all the videos that we have, and you can go to another YouTube channel that is ilmu tauhid, kalam, cosmology. Even though this material we also put in Islamic psychology PIP, this is to give you a good grounding in kalam cosmology based on my teacher's book, Tenets of Islam, all about kalam cosmology that we are supposed to learn at this is at the when you go to the madrasas in the past. You learn this and you have the knowledge of kalam cosmology in terms of the formal logic and the syllogism. So I have given you some ideas before that in terms of how we want to train you to become life coaches, so that you have a broad base of knowledge in terms of Islamic motivation, coaching, mentoring, counseling, Islam Heart of Love. And for Islam Heart of Love, you have to defend Islam. When you are to defend Islam with wonderful argument, out of knowledge, out of iman, out of ihsan, in very nice way, you can help shape the atheists, the panpsychists, those who don't believe in God, those who believe in many forms of God or whatever it is, to bring them closer towards Islam. So that is our da'wah work. So that's why I'm trying to finish this book, inshallah, just in terms of the formal logic and the kalam cosmology aspect, inshallah. So I've given you that in the 21st century we have to change the ummah to face the challenges, the self, family, ummah and global. And I've given you the idea of the ilmu tawhid, the 20 sifah, as an introduction. You go to all of our previous video and we're still dwelling on the existence of Allah, the wujud of Allah. So there are many parameters in terms of the wujud of Allah. So we have Al-Ghazali logic, we have the proof of the wujud of Allah in various videos before that I have given you. But what is important is for you to understand that we have given you also the scientific. So the theological argument for the wujud of Allah in terms of the finding of the universe, in terms of that this universe comes by a creator, is due to design, scientific proof, existence of the universe, Big Bang and so on. So I'm giving you a lot of the scientific evidence for this cosmological argument, additional to the traditional argument, and many others. But what is important is that as we go deeper into ilmu kalam or formal logic, categorical syllogism, that part of it, you need a background in terms of the philosophical framework of ilmu kalam, or the aim of logic, which started, as I mentioned to you earlier, during the time of Aristotle, Socrates and so on, brought about and defended by the Muslims throughout the centuries, from the 3rd century onwards, with Al-Imam Ash'ari, Al-Imam Al-Mutridi, then it carry on all the way up to today. But if you want to be able to succinctly bring your proof, you must think rationally and logically. To think rationally and logically and bring your evidence in terms of your minor premise, your major premise, and then your conclusion, you must be able to elucidate that in a very systematic, formal manner. That is the whole idea of the science of logic or kalam, and that's the whole idea of categorical syllogism. So that knowledge is very important. So any student in the past, when they go to the higher madrasah, all right, they will learn this whole framework of ilmu kalam, all right. And the ilmu kalam now is being taught in philosophy department in the universities. So if you go to any university, the first thing that you want to take to become a qualified philosopher, you must learn the science of formal logic and the science of categorical syllogism, so that you can then relate and bring your point of view logically, without anger, without rancor, without twisting around and so on. This logic is very important. So this shapes your mind to give you a good grounding in terms of the beauty of Islam. Imagine 1,000 years ago we have already formalized this science of kalam, and we teach all our students those days. But unfortunately, even the graduate of today's do not have the basic understanding of ilmu kalam or formal logic and categorical syllogism. So before I proceed to the next video, I want you to go to YouTube, self-study on YouTube. You can get 25 videos, formal logic and categorical syllogism, 20 videos. Go to YouTube, Phil Helper, Philhelper, and then you can see a lot of students who are doing philosophy will go there and study through this Phil Helper website. All right, and when you complete that, when I go to the next phase of teaching you, for example, wujud from the 7 derivatives or 9 derivatives of ilmu kalam, then you will not be confused, because if I go straight away to that, you say, hey, what am I talking about? What nonsense is this? So I hope you study the 25 videos, even not 25 videos, the 4 or 5 videos which relate to categorical syllogism. How this is framed up, what is, for example, the mood, what is the figure, and how the range of A, E, I, O, what are they, the 4 ranges, and how they are in consonant or in conflict, and why they are absurd or why they are viable. And all this entails very rational, logical thinking. So I hope you go to Phil Helper, take a few videos, study this, and inshallah master the science of logic, so that you can then defend Islam through ilmu kalam, ilmu tawhid, kalam cosmology that we are trying to bring about, inshallah.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to my crash course in formal logic. In this part, we're going to study the crucial topic of categorical syllogisms. We're finally going to take categorical sentences in batches and try to draw conclusions from them. Now, last lesson was kind of short, but this lesson I'm definitely going to keep to my promise to give you 2 college-level lectures in one video, so hold on to your seats. Now, syllogism is a very broad term. It refers to any argument containing 2 premises and a conclusion. Categorical syllogism, by contrast, is a very specific term. It's a syllogism, but each of the 3 sentences, premises and conclusion, have to be categorical sentences. To illustrate, premise, premise, conclusion, syllogism. By contrast, categorical sentence to a conclusion of a categorical sentence, that's your categorical syllogism. So, just to give you a concrete example, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. That is a categorical syllogism. Now, it may be a little difficult to see on the surface of it, but these are all categorical sentences of either the A, E, I, or O type. We just have to take all men are mortal and swap it out for all men are mortal beings, because mortal beings would designate a category. And as for Socrates as a man, how about instead all persons identical to Socrates? That way we have an appropriate subject class in that second premise. And just take these 2 switches and put them into your conclusion. Instead of Socrates as a mortal, all persons identical to Socrates are mortal beings. You can see that we're moving from an A sentence and an A sentence to an A sentence. That makes this a categorical syllogism. Now let's take a look at these terms that occur in the categorical syllogism, men, mortals, and Socrates. They're kind of links in a chain, and the way those terms hook up makes all the difference in the world to whether an argument works or not. There's a term that occurs twice in the premises, a crucial link. That's called the middle term. Again, thinking of these terms as links in a chain, there's something special about the one that occurs twice among the premises. That is sort of a middle, a link-up that hooks up the other 2 terms in the syllogism. Those other 2 terms are hooked up in the conclusion in an interesting way. Those terms are called the major term and minor term, and they occur in the conclusion. So, look again. The term men occurs twice in the premises, and the term mortal and Socrates, which also occur in the premises, are linked up in the conclusion. It's the middle term that's doing that hookup. So, let's get a closer look here by deleting some stuff. Let's take a look at those other terms. The other term, mortal beings, is called the major term. It occurs 1 time in the premises and once in the conclusion as the predicate. Remember, the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. Now, there's also another term that occurs within the premises one time. It's the term persons identical to Socrates. Here, that term occurs one time in the conclusion as the subject. So, the minor term of the argument, which gets linked up to the major term through the middle term, is the term that occurs one time in the conclusion as a subject. So here you have it again, three terms, each occurring two times in the argument, but where those terms occur makes all the difference as to whether they count as major, minor, and of course the crucial middle. Now we also have something in addition to the major and minor terms in a categorical syllogism. We have the major and minor premises. Because the major term occurs only once in the premises, you can spot it as the major premise, and because the minor term occurs only one time in the premises, wherever that term occurs, it's going to be called the minor premise. Again, that's just because in contrast to the middle term, these terms occur only once in the premises. Hence, they can designate the premises as major and minor in virtue of that fact. Now, when all the previous conditions for a categorical syllogism are met, and the major premise is listed first, as of course major things probably should be, then the categorical syllogism is said to be in standard form. And I'm going to talk a little bit here about standard form, so take some notes. Now, standard form categorical syllogisms are all that we're going to need to analyze from here on. It's all we're going to study, and it may not be obvious to you as to why that's the case. Look at the argument to the left that we've been studying for quite a while. It's pretty much the same as the argument to the right, isn't it? I just swapped out two of the premises, one for the other, but they're the same premises, so if one argument is valid, so is the other. And yet, one of these is approved according to the standards of standard form, and the other's corrupt. Why in the world think that? And on top of the fact that you just wind up with the same argument when you transform a non-standard into a standard form, it's kind of tedious. Consider this example. All watercolors are paintings. Some watercolors are masterpieces. It does follow from this that some paintings are masterpieces. But masterpieces, as you see from the conclusion, is the major term, so we got to swap out and put that major premise as the first one. Well, that seems tedious in addition to the fact that it just winds us up with the exact same argument. So why even do that? Well, sticking to this standard form reduces the number of moods of arguments that we're going to have to analyze. And when I refer to moods, I'm talking about the order of sentence types when a syllogism is in standard form. Now, you could define mood a little differently, just to be any string of sentence types. With our Socrates men immortal argument, we end up with an A premise followed by an A premise followed by an A for a conclusion. So our sentence types for this argument and the mood thereof would be AAA. Or consider the watercolors example. We had a particular premise first and a universal premise second, followed by a particular conclusion, an IAI. But this argument, in contrast to the last one, would give us different moods to analyze to see if it was valid if we allowed different premise orders. Notice that. If we swapped out the green box and the red box there, we'd end up with an AII mood for the argument. Why not just stick with the major forms, or rather standard forms, and that way we'll have fewer moods to analyze when we try to figure out which arguments are valid and which ones are not. It's a good argument for sticking with standard form. Let's review thus far. If you have two premises and a conclusion, that's a syllogism by definition, and if they're all categorical sentences involved, then you have a categorical syllogism. And if the major premise is listed first, followed by the minor, then the conclusion, you have one that is in standard form. And then you can analyze it according to its mood, that is, the order of sentence types in an argument. But in order to tell whether or not a categorical syllogism is valid, we're going to need to know more. Specifically, whether or not that mood of a standard form categorical syllogism is valid depends upon figure. If you know the arguments in standard form, you know roughly where the major, minor, and middle terms are going to show up. You know the major term is going to be in premise 1 in the conclusion, for example. But figure nails down where these terms show up, and that's when we know exactly what type of argument we're dealing with and whether it's valid or not. To illustrate the need, we used an example before involving watercolors being masterpieces and paintings. Now, if this is an IAI form, as we said before, now does the validity of this argument show us that an IAI mood of a standard form categorical syllogism will always be valid? try this on for size. I'm going to swap the positions of the middle and minor term, middle and major term in the first and second premise respectively. Some flying animals are mammals. All elephants are mammals. So does it prove that some elephants are flying animals? I don't think that conclusion follows, but again, we're dealing with an IAI mood. Obviously, to find out which IAIs are valid or not, we need to nail down where the middle term occurs and whether it occurs in the proper spot in each of the premises. How are we going to do that? Well, here I'm going to call in a little help from a big friend. Not a personal friend at all. In fact, not even a logician. Multiple-time Mr. Olympia, Jay Cutler. Man, look at the size of this guy's back. It's a guy who maybe likes to work on his figure quite a bit. So, for those in the mood to show off their figures, let's use this guy as an illustration, or rather a mnemonic device to remember what figures there are for us to memorize. Now, there are exactly 4 figures, places that the middle term could show up, assuming that the predicate of the conclusion will be in the first premise of the argument. The middle term, as in figure 1, could be listed first, and then listed second in premise number 2, and so on and so forth. These pretty well exhaust all the ways that the middle term could show up in the premises of an argument. How in the world is Jay Cutler going to help us remember figure 1, 2, 3, and 4? Well, maybe this isn't helpful for you, but it sure helps me out an awful lot. So, thank you, Jay Cutler. So, now what we've done is we've pinpointed where that middle term is going to show up in any given premise, and that's what we needed to do to get around that problem with the flying elephants example earlier, right? So now we can tell which arguments, categorical syllogisms that is, are going to be valid or not. That's some good news, but there's also some bad news. The good news is now that we can pinpoint where the middle term is, thanks to figures, we can take an inventory of all the valid categorical syllogisms. What use is that, though? You going to memorize them all? Well, here comes some more good and bad news. In the Middle Ages, they did come up with a method to memorize all the valid moods given a figure. Here you go, people. Somebody made a list of names in the Latin so that under each figure just listed, you could tell which mood is going to be a valid one. Under figure 1, Barbara is a famous example. AAA is valid on 1. The mood EAE is also valid, and so on and so forth. So all you have to do, guys, to memorize which mood is valid on which figure is to memorize Barbara, Celerant, Dari, Fario, Barbary, so on and so forth all the way through. Isn't that easy? Heck no, it's not easy. To make matters worse, this covers all the arguments or standard form syllogisms that are valid. Notice there's a distinction here. The ones at the top are very different from the ones at the bottom. The ones at the top are unconditionally valid. Those are the ones that are valid given Boolean assumptions, namely that universals premises have no existential import. But there's the Aristotelian categorical syllogisms, the ones that are valid on the assumption that the universals carry existential import. So in addition to memorizing this list of names, you're going to have to memorize the distinctions between what's valid on which assumption. Oh boy, how can we make this easy? I guess if you want to make use of mood, figure, and standard form to tell which arguments are valid or not, you've got a lot of memorizing ahead of you, don't you? Well, let me help you out here. There's a problem and a benefit to this little example listed here in the gray. There's a certain form, EIO, that is valid on every single figure, and that's what I'm going to make use of to revise this very old and time-honored mnemonic device. If it deserves to be called a mnemonic device at all, who wants to memorize this list of Latin names? For my 2 cents, you shouldn't do it. It's obsolete, and I'm going to come up with something better. The thing that I think is better, I call the neighbor's mnemonic. Those figures and moods that I listed in the gray, they all take the pattern or mood EIO. EIO is valid on every single one of the figures that we studied. And I'm going to make use of that to come up with a superior mnemonic device to that which has been used throughout the ages. So to get our new project going, I'm going to need a little help from my friends Barbra Streisand, known for her political singing and movie career, and also Alfonso Ribeiro, who's known for his roles in classic sitcoms that many of you watched, and lastly Orlando Bloom, who's probably best known for his role as Legolas in the Lord of the Rings series. Notice the neat thing is each of these persons has a name that corresponds, a modern and not a Latin name, that corresponds to some of the valid moods on each of the figures, the AAA, AOO, and the OAO. I wonder if we can use this in order to memorize our valid moods given a figure. Think of this first. Barbara's neighbors maiming feared. I'm not asking you why Barbara has neighbors who fear maiming. Just remember that phrase, Barbara's neighbors maiming feared. And notice I'm using the word neighbors here. Look at figure number 1 and the moods that are valid on it under Boolean assumptions. Barbara's neighbors maiming feared covers each and every one of these in the English, not with those ridiculous lists of Latin names. You're one step towards getting all the valid moods given figures 1 through 4. Let's see if we can make the rest of those leaps. We'll make that next little jump with Alfonso's help. Alfonso's neighbors apparently don't like to have jobs. Don't ask me why, but Alfonso's neighbors feared careers, just as much as Barbara's neighbors maiming feared. So if you can remember that Alfonso's neighbors feared careers, you're just one step closer to memorizing all of the valid moods given a figure. Only this time it's going to be figure number 2. On figure number 2, Alfonso's neighbors feared careers corresponds, in terms of the vowels in it, to the vowels listed in each one of the Latin names in figure 2. Congratulations, you're one step closer. Can we make the last 2 leaps to figure 3 and figure 4? In fact, we're going to do both of them at the same time. With a little help from Orlando Bloom. Orlando's neighbors disdain maiming and disdain careers for neighbors. I got a whole bunch of people showing disdain towards careers up in my little picture here. I hope you can remember it. It's goofy and just goofy enough to be remembered. But if you can remember that Orlando's neighbors disdain maiming and disdain careers for neighbors, then you've gotten all the way towards memorizing the valid moods given figures. Which figure does that handle? Figure 3 and 4 together. Notice that figure 3 has 4 valid moods on Boolean assumption, and figure 4 has 3 valid moods. So while this isn't a perfect example or illustration or mnemonic device, Orlando's neighbors disdain maiming corresponds to all the vowels listed under figure 3 and the names thereof. And disdain careers for neighbors, as long as you can list 4 as not an extra word. After all, what sort of valid mood would have just one O, F-O-R? Get rid of that and you have disdain careers neighbors, and that corresponds in terms of its vowels to all of the valid moods under figure 4. Congratulations, you're done. So remember, instead of Barbara, Celerant, Dari, Ferio, and all this other stuff that comes under the green portion, that is the portion of this diagram that lists valid Boolean moods, let's just take it a different route. How about instead, Barbara's neighbors maiming feared, Alfonso's neighbors feared careers, Orlando's neighbors disdain maiming and disdain careers for neighbors. There you go, you're done. Now, isn't that mnemonic a little silly? I guess we can answer that question forthrightly. It's about as silly as it comes. Barbara's neighbors maiming feared, Alfonso's neighbors feared careers, Orlando's neighbors disdain maiming and disdain careers for neighbors. Well, I just memorized all the valid moods, and it's not as silly as trying to remember all those Latin lady names, unless you have just a good memory in Latin. And one last big note, there's another advantage to my mnemonic device, apart from that mnemonic that's better than the mnemonic device where you memorize all those Latin. For any word that I use in that mnemonic device, for example, the word feared, it's used to denote that EAE is valid on a particular figure. And I never repeat any other word where EAE is going to be valid. Any place you find feared is where EAE is going to be valid. Any place you don't find the word feared, EAE is invalid. And that goes for every word and every possible combination of vowels in the mnemonic device. Pretty helpful, huh? Well, we still have one last issue here. My little mnemonic device just taught you how to memorize all the moods given a figure that are valid under Boolean assumptions. But what about all those that are valid under Aristotelian assumptions? Notice that in these Latin names, when you look at the vowels in red, you start off with A and E, or E and A, or A and A, universals, and then you move to I's and O's for conclusions. In other words, the universals must have existential import because you're reaching a conclusion that's an I or an O sentence, and those are known to have existential import. Is there any way for memorizing these? I want to point out one thing that may be helpful in memorizing. Captain Hernando in his plane, and he's being chased by some other pilots. Captain Hernando likes to go upwards with his plane. All these other pilots are trying to attain his trajectory. If they're trying to attain Hernando's trajectory, then remember this: there are only 3 valid Aristotelian moods for any figure. If you go back to all those names that were listed under the Aristotelian valid moods in the yellow in the previous slide, you only found 3 combinations of vowels that worked: A, A, I, E, A, O, and A, E, O are the only combinations that are ever going to turn out valid, regardless of figure. Hope this mnemonic device turns out helpful for you. Well, I hope this has been a helpful lesson for you. It certainly helps you memorize the concepts of categorical syllogism, mood figure, and all the other related concepts, and it gives you a helpful mnemonic device to take all that knowledge and put it to some practical use. So just stick to it, and you're going to memorize a whole lot and get good A's in your college courses, and you're going to do so really quickly. In the meantime, as usual, hang around for my exercises on this lesson and my next logic lesson, which will be coming up soon. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.